Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this seminar. I'm Nick Pearce. I'm the Director of the Institute for Policy Research, hosting you today, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome Claire Craig to join us to speak to you today about science and how government listens to scientists. Well, actually, it starts with how does government listen to scientists? Claire has had a very distinguished career in science policy. She was the head of the Government Office for Science on behalf of the Chief Scientific Advisor, the government's Chief Scientific Advisor. It's a very important part of the Whitehall machinery, the Government Office for Science, and a critical part of the infrastructure for bringing scientific knowledge to bear on policy making. And she's now the Director of Science Policy at the Royal Society, who obviously play a critical role in working with government and the scientific community in bringing scientific evidence to bear on public policy. So she's really well placed to talk to us today, and I know there's a lot of interest from across the university in these kinds of questions. You could be forgiven for thinking that nothing much is happening in British government at the moment apart from that unmentionable thing, but there is still a lot of work going on in all the departments, the ministries, doing their day jobs and using science in different ways to do that work. And we're going to hear today from Claire about how this really works and some of the issues and challenges that scientists, but also policy officials, civil servants and others face when they're addressing these kinds of questions. So Claire, it's delightful to have you here. I'll hand over to you now. Claire.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about my favourite subject. And what I'm going to talk about draws on the experience that Nick has described. So a lot of it comes back to the moments when chief scientific advisors or other senior scientists are talking directly to people, generally in national government, because that's where most of my experience is, the kind of Nobel laureate meets a minister moment. But actually, in thinking about that, you can, I think, pull out all sorts of issues that are much more general to conversations, individual and collective, when somebody who cares a lot about policy and public matters but doesn't know very much about science is speaking to somebody who believes that they have some important evidence that's relevant to that, but maybe doesn't understand the politics. So those are kind of more general matters. And my premise, and the premise in the book which gives this title, is twofold. One is that, in fact, science advice is still often a kind of quite an amateur function, when there is nevertheless a lot of learning from a lot of disciplines and indeed from practice that could and should more rapidly be brought to bear. In other words, you don't have to start from scratch each time a chief scientific advisor gets appointed to a new government department or somebody heads up a review or working group. So there is a lot of learning and reflection there, and I want to kind of make sure that gets spread faster, including places like this one. And the other is that it's a kind of dizzying combination of high concept and detailed craft skill. In other words, if you are at a moment when a minister meets a top scientist, then what appears to be at stake is kind of high matters of the validity of whatever the discipline might be, of physics or chemistry or some detailed natural sciences and complex systems on the one hand, and on the other matters of state and potentially lives and welfare and national security at stake. Of course, what's also going on is what's the temperature, what time of day is it, kind of what's the layout, who else is in the room, those kind of details. And quite often one of the interesting things about working on conversations, and again, it doesn't have to be in Whitehall, it can be anywhere else, is the kind of craft skill of the curation of the conversation. Because the facts, by and large, don't speak for themselves. It's who is speaking for them and how and when and what's creating the listening environment, kind of curating the conversation, if you like. Anyhow, that's quite a lot of preamble, and a pretty good starting point for kind of surfacing some of the kind of challenges is this one. It's a statement that I first heard from Adair Turner, who was, amongst other things, chair of the Climate Change Committee and ran the big review on that led to the raising of the pension age and various other things, so knows quite a lot about evidence in government. The point here is this: if a statement is true, perfectly true, then by and large it's tautological, or it's so bounded and qualified, it's so carefully expressed in single disciplinary terms, it's so specific that it is unlikely to be useful to a kind of wider policy audience. On the other hand, I think this statement is probably not perfectly true. think about it for a moment. Anyhow, right, I'm going to jump in now. So there's a scholar of science in policy called Roger Pilker, based in the States, and he talks about tornado and abortion politics. And I'm going to just give you a classic tornado moment. So this is cast your minds back to when the Fukushima civil emergency happened after the Great Japanese earthquake. In the UK national government, what was going on was that the Prime Minister called the COBRA committee, which is called in civil emergencies. That has a standing arrangement alongside of it called SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Group in Emergencies, which is led by the government chief scientific advisor, who in this case was John Beddington. And the question that the Prime Minister in COBRA was asking the SAGE was, is it more safe for British citizens to stay in Tokyo or to go? So it was a very, in Pilker terms, it was a tornado question. There was evidence that needed to be applied to the question. It was by and large not a values-based question. He would contrast this with, say, matters of abortion, where probably, by and large, there isn't so much scientific or technical issues at stake, but there are very strong value-based ones. So this is a classic of tornado politics. And what John did, remember that if you cast your mind back, this is a highly uncertain moment. So it's questions of what was actually going on in Fukushima nuclear plants, what was the weather going to be like, what directions were the winds going to blow, what was likely to happen given very low levels of radiation that might or might not end up in affecting civilians in Tokyo, and then actually, and this is a kind of a real world example, what are the dangers of the other or the risks of the other courses of action, because you get exposure to radioactivity if you take a long haul jet flight. So there are risks either way. Anyhow, so John had to do that over a period of hours and 2 or 3 days in the end, and give advice to the Prime Minister, which was basically the risks of going are likely to be the risks of greater than the risks of staying, and that was the advice that the Prime Minister followed. Some other governments took different views based off what presumably could have been the same evidence. So there's another big learning there which comes up time and time again, which is you give the evidence, but actually there's a political judgment on top of it. And this pattern of advice giving in emergencies, it exemplifies a whole heap of other things that are really relevant to what's going on at other longer term issues, particularly the bringing together of different forms of evidence. So there is no, I would think it's safe to say, there's no big public policy question to which one discipline has the answer. And quite a lot of the skill, both in providing advice and being people working on the interface, like chief scientific advisors, is how you bring together the right kinds of disciplines and how you create the conversations or frame the issues such that they can all contribute, and then you give something that is nevertheless meaningful, given that scientists, of course, are all deeply suspicious because they have different framings and different languages, and as soon as you start speaking outside of your field, you may find that you are at risk of losing credibility with your hinterland. So an extreme form of this actually was under Ebola, when a similar structure was created. The Scientific Advisory Group gave advice, and there, just in the beginning, they did not go far enough to include humanities scholars, and in particular, as a result of advice given early, became very clear that the advice on tackling the most recent Ebola outbreak wouldn't be effective unless historians and anthropologists who specialise in the various regions were brought in to provide advice on indigenous practices. So the cross-disciplinary element can go really wide, and it's certainly not about physical sciences only. At the Royal Society, with the Academy of Medical Sciences, we try to go further. The thing about providing synthesised advice across disciplines is that, by and large, nobody pays you for it, and it isn't necessarily the fastest way to a kind of high academic status publication. It's often quite hard to get published. So there's a failure, there's a lack of incentives and rewards in the system for providing this kind of synthesised evidence. So at the academies, we put together a report really trying to make it easier to do the right thing by saying, despite the lack of incentives, there nevertheless are quite a lot of models and different ways of doing it from the very long scale. The gold standard would be the IPCC, providing advice right across a whole range of disciplines on a very routine basis to political decision makers. thinkers, with the SAGE, the example I was just giving of vice and civil emergencies being the kind of other end of the spectrum, doing it really, really quickly, just with the knowledge that's in people's heads and kind of imparted verbally. But there's a lot of ranges of mechanisms in between. So it does happen, but actually our premise was it's not sufficiently rewarded. So Pilke and others also talk a lot about framing, and one of the other really big challenges in acting at the interface between science and government is that, if you think about it, there's really little reason for the knowledge that's coming out of the science space, which will have been developed by decades or centuries of people within a discipline pursuing questions that they believe to be really exciting, but are tractable within the terms of the discipline. There's no real reason why that should actually ever align with the public policy question of the moment, where what appears to be the given framing is the result of stakeholder groups, of the history of the way you've arrived at it, and a whole range of other things. And into this mismatch, this kind of structural mismatch, walks factors like the tendency of the framing of debates to be around, I've called them charismatic entities. So to tread immediately into kind of controversial ground, one of the things, if you look at the history of bovine TB and badger culling, is in a sense a mismatch between a framing that often focused on a very charismatic entity, to wit the badger, and a set of stakeholders and issues around that, when the longer-term solutions to bovine TB come out of rather less charismatic discussions about systems, about biosecurity, about business models, about managing domestic and agricultural animal populations in harmony, etc., etc. And you can see the minister's eyes glaze over almost, or the journalists do, when on the one hand you've got a scientific framing, if you like, and on the other a kind of rather more compelling narrative. And these, now this isn't always bad, because of course a compelling narrative is what you need to get people to focus on an issue. So the right narrative draws attention, frames, directs, and helps people to remember things. But the message to scientists, who often think that these things don't matter, is to think really hard about how their, as it were, more academic advice may be contextualised. So Mark Walport, who was Government Chief Scientific Advisor before he moved to head up the UK Research and Innovation body, being a former medic, used to talk about lenses. So the way he would often talk with other scientists was to talk about the different lenses of a problem. And this is helpful because quite often you find that either the advisor or the politician is thinking more about one than the other and not acknowledging the range of different possibilities. So the example of fracking had a very specific moment. When the first stories about, in quotes, earthquakes in Blackpool came up some years ago, then the then Government Chief Scientific Advisor asked the Royal Academy of Engineering and the Royal Society to do a short report on the risks from fracking. And there was immediately a bit of a discussion, because what the scientists really wanted to do was answer, in quotes, kind of the right question, the big question, which was, what does this mean for carbon budgets, carbon footprints, carbon overall impact for energy markets, and so on. What the government needed at that point and wanted at that point was a much narrower question, which was about the physical and environmental risks directly from fracking. And for scientists, sometimes there's a choice, which is, do you work on a question which is likely to have an immediate impact and relevance, or do you, as it were, say to the government, well, you may be interested in that question, but let me tell you, the question you really need to worry about is this one, and in a couple of years' time I'll come back with you on with some more information about that. And by and large, a long-term tactic is to try and do a bit of both. And one of the things you see with really effective scientific advisors is that they're there when ministers want them and need them, like at Fukushima, and that buys a kind of license to be part of the conversation on things that are much longer term, or where the minister doesn't necessarily want to hear what needs to be done, but you've built the trust and the relationship to bring it back. So sticking with controversy for a moment, there was a really, to those of us who care about how science advice gets given and received, there was actually a really interesting sequence of events around these two drugs. On ecstasy, for those who may remember, there was a moment when the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs was asked to look at ecstasy, and it came back with a view that the harms from ecstasy were such that it wasn't great, they were not sufficient to classify it at the higher level of drug classification with all of the regulation and controls that come around with that. The government of the day said, thank you very much for that advice, we're going to classify it nonetheless. There was a various sequence of events, but Professor David Nutt in particular left the Advisory Council, and then and subsequently has been very vociferous. And a lot of scientists at that time saw this as an example of the kind of worst case of, venal, short-term, stupid ministers not able to listen to advice, scientists giving the advice and being completely ignored. And that undoubtedly does happen. However, what that moment led to was a set of discussions and then actually guidance, which you can see on the web and is widely available, about what's going on here. And in shorthand, it says, for those scientists who are working closely with government and to ministers, sort of two things, and it's basically mutual respect. Scientists have a duty to give the best possible evidence that they can, and to do that without fear or favour. And I've never met a scientist who wasn't committed to doing that when working with government. And ministers absolutely must listen and should, but ministers are subject to a much wider range of pressures. They're democratically accountable. If they choose to do something which does not appear to be in line with whatever the evidence was that the scientist has given, they should actually explain why they do that, but then the scientist should accept that. So a counterexample to what happened with ecstasy was what happened with CAT, K-H-A-T, where the Advisory Council essentially said the same thing. This is not a highly harmful drug. And the Home Secretary of the day met the chair of the council. It was absolutely clear to him that she had understood what the basis was of this evidence that they were giving. She then went off, she made the same decision as had previously happened, and sent a letter, which is publicly available, saying why she'd done that, which includes issues like the fact that classifying CAT in the way that she did made it easier operationally for the police to operate internationally because it was in line with other countries. Now, you can still take a view as to whether that was the right thing to do or not, but from the point of view of those who care about whether the evidence was there and whether it was clearly listened to in the sense of known, then that was a better example of that kind of relationship. So I talked about the craft skill, and there are some kind of points of specificity that, again, sort of scientists with the knowledge they want to impart and ministers in the heat of the moment don't always pay careful attention to. Numbers and images and words. So on numbers, this is another area where there's a lot of knowledge now, a lot of it actually coming out of either public health or climate change debates, where we've got kind of 40 years of reflection that we can of experience to look back on about what and how numbers do and don't work. Quite a lot of that also comes out of risk. So this is an example, just partly because I think it's another good example of how governments do actually seek out science advice and listen to it. This is an example of what's now quite a routine thing, which is the National Risk Register. That is run by Cabinet Office. There's a version like this, which is natural hazards and accidents. There's another which is about kind of terrorism and all those nasty things. But what this does is routinely go out and say, what's the best evidence about a number of major risks that face the government? What can we say about their impact and their likelihood? And then it's used to inform planning. And contingency measures, and that's now a kind of routinized part. In those kinds of discussion, questions about what it means to have these numbers, you've got the relative likelihoods down there, what it means to have a political discussion about whether a particular event is likely to happen on a timescale between 1 in 20 and 1 in 2. The numbers, the numbers and their significance there's learning that you can bring to them which shows things like, for example, coming from climate change, under certain circumstances, if you give a range of numbers, if you say it's between 2 and 4, then the person you're speaking to is likely to have greater confidence than if you say it's probably 3, or it's 3 with an error bar or whatever. But there's some actual quite good observational and experimental psychology, for example, or behavioural sciences, and David Spiegelhalter, who runs the new the Centre for the Public Understanding of Risk in Cambridge, has done a lot of this sort of work. So you don't have to be an amateur, if you like, in using numbers in conversations. And there's some examples on the right of this one from a report that the Government Office for Science did. The thing that a lot of physical scientists in particular find incredibly difficult is this business about whether more information, more data, more numbers cause people to change their minds, which in many cases it does not. And I haven't got the graphic here, but there's a lovely triangle, people may know it, triangular kind of graphic. I think it's from Chris de Meyer, which basically says if you take 2 people here, one of whom marginally believes in climate change and one of whom anthropogenic, one of whom marginally doesn't think the evidence is sufficient, then over time what happens is they notice different things, they associate with different people, they ask different questions, and what happens as they learn more is that they get further and further apart in their views and more entrenched. So as it were, more information doesn't bring them together, it actually entrenches views. And that's really, really difficult for a lot of scientists and more other academics to get to grips with. This slide is intentionally blank because I just wanted to talk about images, which is another thing that a lot of physical scientists don't quite get. So if I were to ask you to visualize in the context of climate change, say, a polar bear on a fragmentary ice flow, or a turtle wrapped in plastic, you probably could, yeah? So a powerful image that signifies and draws attention to a particular big suite of complex issues can be really, really important in terms of, as I say, kind of drawing attention and often also creating an environment in which there isn't just, hey, there's an issue, but also, hey, there's an issue that matters and this is why. And that can be, in some instances, very powerful, and in others, it can kind of operate against the kind of centre of gravity or the direction of the evidence. But whatever it is, it's important to know that it matters. The same with words. So this really came home to a lot of physical scientists with the ClimateGate issues and the emails that came out there. And there's a lovely website with some examples if you want, sort of 20 or 30. But basically, in a laboratory setting or amongst disciplinary colleagues, to say something is theoretical may actually mean it's stronger than something that's evidence-based. In other words, it's a theory, I don't know, theory of gravity or of relativity. You know, it's theoretical may be a powerful statement, but to say something theoretical in public speak obviously implies, well, I think obviously, generally implies it's theoretical. You know, why would you listen to that? Bias has many technical meanings, but when it's used in general conversation, almost always is heard as prejudiced. And manipulation, which is one of the words that I think was in a ClimateGate email, to manipulate data to one scientist talking to another is just a kind of, you know, it's a technical term, but to manipulate data more generally, well, you can see where it's going. Right, so I wanted to come on to thinking about the future, because when you kind of unpick quite a lot of the uncertainties and the anxieties about kind of what's going on when scientists are talking in policy settings, is about how you translate what ultimately is always observational evidence about the past into decisions which are always concerned about the future. There is within that even a kind of, I think it's the White Queen in Alice in Wonderland, who calls out, shrieks out in pain when Alice says why. She says, well, I'm going to be scratched tomorrow, so I'm feeling the pain now. There's a sense in which a decision being taken now is being taken with all of the pain of what might happen as a result of that decision in the future. Yeah. So you're there in a room, a decision's going to be taken, the pain is now, the outcomes are in the future and may indeed never be known because they're about counterfactuals which won't happen, and the evidence is always in the past. It's jolly tricky when you start unpicking. It's amazing decisions get made as frequently as they do. So where do you go? Well, one place is models, and that is really disconcerting. Models in a wide-ranging term really is quite a good kind of overarching concept. So here are some examples. The model of an architectural model of St Paul's before it was built. A novel, Persuasion, as an example of modelling social and personal and familial relationships. An amazing thing that's in the Science Museum, which uses water to model financial systems and the economy. And then the kind of more commonplace quantitative models, a model of a city involving lots of data and modelling used to design cars. So modelling in all sorts of ways, but what they're trying to do is abstract principles from the past, from observational data or including personal experience, and say things about the world in ways that can be used to explain what's going on and in some ways to predict, usually multiple possible futures, in order to have a hold on them and to begin to make decisions. Another of the really good things that the UK government has done in terms of science in government is for more than 20 years, it's had a programme called Foresight, which looks, as it says in the name, it looks longer term in order to inform near-term decisions. And since the turn of the century, it's been a scheme that's run into a small number of really big projects, looking 10 to 100 years ahead. This one's quite old, but that means there's some history to it. So Dave King, who was Government Chief Scientific Advisor then, set up a project on flooding. This involved historic data on flood risk in houses in England and Wales that was available for several decades going back, that was put into a quantitative model that, believe it or not, this is really heroic, that then was nested with the Hadley Centre's models of global climate change and was then forecast, sort of stepped forward under different scenarios to 2080. So this is heroic modelling, okay? Starting back from these really granular data on 10-kilometre grid squares about flood risk, right the way through to the future. So, that at the time, that was extremely powerful. It was used by Treasury and DEFRA to justify some significant increases in flood risk management. It basically says that under any plausible set of arrangements, you are going to have increased flood risk. So it was used to justify spending decisions then. It was also used elsewhere, and the kind of modelling then, another of the nice things about models is that you can spread them, you can reuse them and adapt them for different situations. So it was used elsewhere. And it was part of the evidence base that led to the UK taking this amazing statutory political decision to introduce statutory carbon budgets, which is really quite a significant thing when you think about the range of responses in different countries. This also shows about images, though, because Dave will talk about putting this on the table in Cabinet. Basically, it's irresistible. But if you're a normal human being, when you see this, and if you own a house, if you're fortunate enough to own a house, you just go like, which square is my house in? Yeah? And what's its colour? And if you show it to a politician, they go, where's my constituency? Yeah? So it was another nice example of the power of a graphic. At the right moment. What we also did with that, and this is kind of increasingly important as computational power goes up and software improves, is you can use models in more kind of participative and engaging ways. You can hand the power over. So if you're a scientist, you don't have to come in and say, in my judgment, the most plausible scenario for flood risk is X, and here's Y, and let me explain it to you in great detail. You can let people play. So this, which is now, way old software, but this was based on the same modelling that you saw with the other graphics, but actually it was just a little kind of SimCity type thing where you'd be in charge, you'd put somebody in charge of an area, they'd have decisions to make in investment in flood defences, in economics, in healthcare. They'd have to kind of run it like a public authority, and then some climate would happen to them. It'd step forward 10 years and another 10 years, and the climate would throw things and they'd get kind of voted in or out, and you tried to stay in power for a century. And doing that really it helps with a large number of things. One is it shows, for example, some basics of political decision making, but which is hard to explain to people often, which is that the same choices would lead to different outcomes because you couldn't determine what the climate was going to do. And actually that's quite helpful if you're locked in a political discussion now, because it stops people trying to get the one true answer. And you can say that, but actually if you get people to feel it, then you're kind of changing the political discussion in a way that's really helpful. The other is that if you play with a model a lot, you get an intuitive feeling for a complex system without having to ever know that's actually what you're doing. Because if you try to talk to a minister about a complex system, then you might have to show them this. And it's probably downhill from there, unless you've got a really nerdy one. I think that's fair, yeah? So we did a Foresight project on obesity, and this was a lovely systems map, very elegant. In fact, through the project, we then kind of clustered it and into kind of rather more tractable subsystems, and that's usually the way to go, to hide the wiring, almost literally to hide the wiring diagram. The other thing about this was a project, I think it looked out to 2040 or thereabouts. The other thing that was interesting about this project was that it was used by both a Labour government and then a Conservative government as an evidential basis for what were in some parts similar, but in some parts quite different policy decisions. So part of the learning here for scientists actually is about, it's twofold. One is we separated out the evidence base from the more speculative stuff, and that meant the evidence base had a longer shelf life. The other was, it's just very interesting to observe that you can plausibly use the same sets of evidence to have very different views on the role of the state in what you should do about them. And you can see that in the basis of these two quite different strategies that nevertheless have as their underpinning one source of evidence. The biggest thing that this project did, which is qualitative really, was it was impossible to look at that diagram for, DWP to look at it and say, actually it's just the Department of Health's problem, or for the Department of Health to say, well actually if DEFRA could sort out the food companies it would all be okay, or whatever it might be. It just really brought home that it was bigger than any one department. So I'm still going on to the future and thinking about the future. Nesta did quite a good, the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts did a short report called Don't Stop Thinking About Tomorrow, which was about different sorts of futures work, and it distinguished slightly artificially but usefully between forecasting, the kind of big computational, relatively near-term, system well-defined models, foresight, which is the kind of structured thinking about the future that was the examples that I was showing, although it's a more generic term, and fiction being the kind of usually sort of inspirational, often either utopic or dystopic statements that also are part of the discussions that go on about the future. An example of the latter at the moment, they abound in AI and discussions about AI and AI in the future of work, AI in the future of humanity. Here, Demis Hassabis of Google Deep Minds talk about solving for intelligence and then using that to solve for everything else. That's an amazing future statement, and it's clearly a statement for him of aspiration. So we did a Foresight project on the future of cities, which included looking back at how people had looked at the future of cities during the course of the 20th century. This was just a particular example I liked because in this magazine from 1961, you've got four particular thoughts about futures of cities, and two are still about as far away as they ever were, colonies in space and a kind of Harry Potter type, whatever it's called, Quidditch sports, yeah, or Ender's Game, and two are pretty normal. Yeah? And in 1961, they probably, at least superficially, looked roughly the same. So the problem with thinking about the future is it's very difficult when you're in 1961 to tell which of those are actually going to be normalised by 2019 and which aren't. However, we're beginning to get more insights and more ways of thinking about the future. And they're coming from all sorts of different areas. There's a really interesting work by Lawrence Friedman on the future of war, for example, that bears on this. And in this piece of work, because architects architects are one of the few areas where there's been consistent, significant investment in thinking about the future, usually of cities, sometimes of buildings, in ways that accommodate both the real stuff that has to be built and the highly imaginary. So you've got quite a lot of very speculative architectural thinking about the future, alongside of things which have actually influenced what's happened, like garden cities. So garden cities have a heritage that starts at the turn of the 1902, so the turn of the century there. And you can see that mapping in English cities thinking with real hardcore decisions, whereas some other things much less so, but only in the UK. In the US and France, you don't see the same things. Anyhow, you can see I'm getting on now to a subject where most of what I've said so far, I would say there's a lot of established knowledge, and those who are interested can draw on that, these issues about science communication, about modelling, and so on. The kind of more kind of speculative areas where I think there's a lot more to do in terms of research broadly come under the headings of narrative and policy. So one of the narratives that was going around, sticking with the theme of flooding for a moment and staying quite local, during the Somerset Levels flooding, you may remember quite a strong narrative in the public engagement and the public discussions was around whether the Environment Agency had dredged and certain rivers and whether it should have dredged them and whether dredging would help at the time. So at the centre of government at the time we were doing various things. We were pulling in, this was a back in the Cobra Sage type situation, we were pulling in expertise from the Dutch, from the US. We were basically saying, look, there's a very large flat surface here with a lot of water on it, kind of what can we do to get this water off? Looking at things like I can't remember what they're called, but the pumps that go Archimedes screws. Anyhow, you get through. There were practical things that were being looked at, but that technical advice was also against this narrative of very strongly felt narrative of this wouldn't have happened if our local knowledge had been listened to, and if the Environment Agency had responded differently. Now that again, that kind of matters. Some scientists would say, I mean, rightly, and there's a place for sort of all of these views. Some scientists would basically say, you know, the best thing I can do is simply give the evidence on the basis of what I can speak about, and it's called in Pilker's framework kind of being a science arbiter. I will stick to that. Some try and do what's called being an honest broker, give advice, scientific advice that increases the number of possibilities that may be considered in the policy space. And some become science advocates, which basically means going further towards saying, I have some knowledge here. You take Dave King in the sort of the turn of the century as a physical scientist with knowledge about what climate modelling was showing, basically saying, you know, I'm not just going to tell you that this is important, I'm going to tell you this is so important, you must act. And that's going a step further, if you like. Anyhow. So on narrative, this is very speculative, and I'm coming towards the end, but I think this is so interesting, and we're on the cusp of being able to kind of think about this and reflect on it and study it much better. What you've got here is just a correlation, right? The bars show a piece of work, not yet I think published, in which a chap looked at the English language transcripts of all of the mainstream films for the last 10 years. They exist because of needing to have them for the hard of hearing. And set loose a machine learning system that basically pattern spotted on these transcripts. It was part of a study that we were involved in looking at AI and how people talk about AI. And what this basically shows is that there are clusters of concerns in these films, in the dialogue and in the plot, which associate control with AI. So in other words, the films are about, is the AI controlling the humans? Who's in control of the AI? Whatever. And more so, this is highly qualitative, but you get my drift, more so with AI than with some other things that you might have put in the same bracket, as in a kind of plot driver that is a bit techie, that is jolly scary. So you've got something going on there. At the same time, we at the Royal Society were doing the first very sober, very careful public dialogue on AI. So this was now 2 years ago. We had people of mixed socio-economic background, mixed educational background, 2 days, equal footing with the scientists who were there, able to explore issues as they wished. this issue of control was coming up in this highly non-fictional setting in ways that actually suggested this was also something really important that then we were putting alongside of the scientific advice about what these systems are likely to actually be able to do and why that matters. And that in turn has led to a number of policy outcomes like the introduction of the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, which was an announcement by the government about a year ago. But it was a correlation, and it was a correlation and this sense of could we in any way understand better how, in particular, how non-narrative evidence in all of the forms I've been showing it, narratives which cross over from fictional and non-fictional, because a model is a fiction, by the way, if you think about it, a model is always fictional, and fiction, and could you use that? However, right, so this is my final slide. There is a piece of work for the Institute for Government, which was set up with money by Lord Sainsbury and does a lot of really good work on thinking about how government operates and really trying to advise and improve it. They did a piece of work based on a qualitative approach to 6 case studies. But these were areas where policy had changed in a way that was significant that you might not have anticipated would have been possible at the start. So the introduction of the ban on smoking in public places, a national minimum wage, the statutory carbon budgets, unleaded petrol, seatbelts, and something else that I can't remember. Looked, and it's only qualitative, but looked in quite a fine-grained way through interviews with people involved at what the conditions for that success meaning policy that followed the accumulating evidence was. And you've got the list there. The thing that I just wanted to really finish with was this point about leadership and relationships. And this wasn't about a particular elite conversation, although that is sometimes a moment where you can see something change, but actually around that is a set of relationships and persistence across individuals in governments, in science, in academia, in business, in NGOs, people who are persistent on the issue and quite often either work very closely across those boundaries or move between them over time. And that appeared to be one of the conditions for success of that kind of really fundamental shift. I find that really quite... well, it's useful to know that it takes a bit of time, although sometimes you can get frustrated. You've got this evidence and you feel it should be listened to and it's not being listened to quickly enough. It takes time, but also quite hopeful because it's really saying people who are persistent and caring about particular types of evidence or shift can make a difference. And then my final slide is some suggestions of what, depending on what stage of your career, if you are an academic, you might want to do. Those are some suggestions, and I'm really sorry. It's my first book, so I had to put a picture up. Thank you.